From Bloomberg World Headquarters in New York to our TV and radio audiences worldwide, I'm David Weston. Welcome now to Balance of Power, where the world of politics meets the world of business. On the brief today, Kevin Cerulli from the White House on administration reaction to the storming of the U.S. Embassy in Baghdad, Alex Harris on the Federal Reserve apparently winning its year-end repo battle, and Stephen Engel on the fallen auto titan Carlos Ghosn fleeing Japan for Lebanon. We start now with Kevin Cerulli at the White House. So, Kevin, we talked about it a little bit before. What do we know about the White House reaction? Were they anticipating this sort of reaction from Iraq?
Well, the Secretary of Defense Mark Esper saying that they are now working with the Iraqis to make sure that that U.S. embassy in Iraq is protected after it was stormed by protesters in response to that U.S. missile strike in Iraq as well as Syria on Sunday. The administration saying that this was a defensive measure given Iran's expansionary policies into Iraq and meddling into Iraq. The president, for his part, taking to Twitter in a series of tweets all throughout the morning, David, he has condemned the attack and called on the Iraqis to work with them to stand up against Iran. Yesterday, I was able to speak with Brian Hook. He is the U.S. Special Envoy to Iran. And what he said is that there are likely now going to be additional sanctions against Iran as part of the administration's maximum economic pressure campaign.
Yeah, as I understand it, there's no question that Iran is closely affiliated with this militia group that actually the U.S. fired the missiles on. And there's no question that some reaction probably was required. But the reaction we're getting is not from Iran right now. It's from Iraq. Do we know whether we really brought our Iraqi allies into the fact that we would be firing these missiles?
Well, it appears to be unknown at this particular point. Obviously, there are forces in Iraq that stand with the United States military, but beyond that, an increasing number of Iranian-backed forces in Iraq has added complexity to the situation that is still very much ongoing. It's part of what President Trump and others in Washington have cautioned against Iran's expansionary policies, and they say that that's a non-starter, especially as they try to get negotiation talks restarted with Iran in the coming new year.
Yeah, it's really chilling video we're watching of that attack on the U.S. embassy in Baghdad. Thank you so much to Bloomberg's Kevin Cerulli reporting today from the White House. And now let's turn to Alex Harris on the Federal Reserve winning, apparently, its year-end repo battle. So we talked an awful lot about this. A lot of people were very nervous.
Yep.
Not so big a problem.
No, it was calm. You know, the Fed did what it intended to do, which was make sure that the year-end was as smooth as possible. And people are like, okay, there's nothing to see here. And for now, everything is calm. But, 2020 is a whole different story.
Well, 2020 is a whole different story. And there may be other things besides repo going on in 2020. What are we anticipating out of the Fed and central banks generally going into the new year?
It's hard to say. What was interesting is at the end of this year, look at the Riksbank and saying we are done with negative rates. And so I think away from the Federal Reserve in the U.S., that's going to be a very interesting story to see, how does the ECB respond to this? How does the BOJ respond to this? Because there's a lot of voices coming, at least from the ECB, saying negative interest rate policy does not work. It's not effective. And so it'll be interesting to see how, these central banks respond to that and how the market adjusts to that.
Which could relieve a little bit of pressure on the Federal Reserve for further cuts.
Absolutely.
If other people are starting to come up, maybe there's not quite a big differential.
Well, and, let's see how the economy does here from a U.S. standpoint. These were insurance cuts. This was to sort of, offset any potential weakness in the economy. So let's see what happens now. I mean, I think the market is still anticipating that they're going to be on hold for the time being. So really a lot of the attention for the Fed is going to be on the balance sheet, is going to be on reserves and what they end up doing, with these repo operations and treasury bill purchases and some of the other, minutia of their policy.
Thanks so much, Alex. Alex has been on 24/7 duty on this repo thing, so now maybe we should get a break going into the new year. Now we turn to Carlos Ghosn, the former head of Nissan and Renault. He is facing trial in Japan, but has just fled the country. Bloomberg's Stephen Engel reports.
Former Nissan boss Carlos Ghosn has confirmed he has fled Japan, where he was awaiting trial for alleged financial crimes, and that he is now in Lebanon. Now, he says he has not fled justice, but escaped injustice and political persecution. Now, people familiar with the matter telling Bloomberg News that Ghosn fled Japan because he didn't believe he would get a fair trial there. Now, in a statement from Beirut, Ghosn said he had been held hostage by a, quote, rigged Japanese justice system. What we don't know is how Ghosn got out of Japan. NHK reports there's no immigration record of Ghosn leaving Japan and that authorities are checking whether he used an alias. Now, Kyoto News Agency says the Tokyo District Court indicates there's been no change to Goins' bail conditions, which required him to surrender his passports. Now, Goin is said to hold several passports, including of Lebanon, which doesn't have an extradition treaty with Japan. Goin's lawyer, speaking in Tokyo, said he knows nothing more about Goin's situation other than what's being reported in the media. The mystery deepens. Stephen Engel, Bloomberg News, Hong Kong.
Thanks so much to Stephen Engel, our colleague over in Asia. And now let's get a check on how the markets are reacting to maybe today's top stories. Joining us now is Abigail Dula. I doubt they're reacting to Carlos Ghosn. I'm not sure. And frankly, I'm not sure we can trust this reaction.
Well, yeah, there's not much of a reaction.
The volume is so low.
Yeah, the volume is so low and the moves are so light, at least for stocks. We have bigger moves for bonds. We have bonds pulling back for a second day and that dollar falling once again. But the big story on this, the last day of the year, the big rally for stocks. So that does tie into what you were talking about with Alex Harris in terms of the Fed cutting rates along with repo. All of that liquidity really helping out stocks. The S&P 500 right now, unless something moves dramatically in the next couple of hours, set for its best year since 2013. The bulls in charge.
It's interesting you make that point, Abigail, because we talk about what a wonderful year it was by and large for the stock market in the United States. No question about it. And by the way, it was pretty good for bonds, too, until the last few days. But the fact is, if you push more dollars at the same number of stocks, the price will go up. I mean, that goes back to Adam Smith. That's not that creative.
It's not that creative, but it works. It's been working for the last decade, really, because, you know, it's interesting. You usually think about stocks and bonds going in opposite directions. And between 1970 and 2000, that was true. But over the last 20 years, both stocks and bonds have rallied. And over the last 10 years, you have to think it is because of that Fed accommodation. That money you're talking about, it's got to go somewhere. Unless it's under the mattress, it's probably going to go where you can make the most money, stocks, and we're seeing the rally.
Well, particularly if the rest of the world's going into negative rates.
That is true. That is true. You got to try to find something somewhere
where
there's a yield.
Many thanks to Abigail Doolittle. By the way, Happy New Year.
Happy New Year.
Great to have Abigail Doolittle always reporting on the markets. And now we turn to Viviana Hurtado. She's here for Bloomberg First Word News.
David, we begin with Donald Trump's former campaign manager. Corey Lewandowski says he's not going to run for a Senate seat. Lewandowski considered entering the Republican primary in New Hampshire. Lewandowski wanted to challenge two-term Democratic Senator Jeanne Shaheen. GOP leaders consider her seat vulnerable. This after she narrowly won re-election in 2014. Staying with President Donald Trump, he says he'll soon sign the first phase of a trade deal with China. He's expected to sign the agreement on January 15th at the White House. The president also says in the new year he'll travel to China to begin on the second phase of the trade deal. And President Donald Trump blaming Iran for an assault on the U.S. Embassy compound in Baghdad. He also is calling on Iraq to protect the facility. The Iraqi militiamen and their supporters were venting their rage, this over U.S. airstrikes on their Iranian-backed comrades. They broke into the compound through a main door and set fire to a reception area, guards firing shots and tear gas to contain them. And Carlos Ghosn had a video camera trained on his door. He was followed everywhere he went in Tokyo. Still, the former Nissan chairman was able to escape from Japan and make his way to Lebanon. Ghosn saying he fled what he called a rigged Japanese justice system. He's been accused of financial crimes and was out on bail, but his movements in Japan were restricted. Ghosn's a citizen of Lebanon. It has no extradition treaty with Japan. Global News, 24 hours a day on air. Now, quick take by Bloomberg, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in more than 120 countries. I'm Viviana Hurtado. This is Bloomberg David.
Thanks so much, Viviana. Coming up, not quite signed, sealed, and delivered, but it's close. It'll be in the new year with a new signing date for the Phase 1 China trade deal. What should we expect from the agreement? That's next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Weston. We finally have a date for the signing of that Phase 1 deal. President Trump tweeted this morning. I will be signing our very large and comprehensive Phase 1 trade deal with China on January 15. The ceremony will take place at the White House. High-level representatives of China will be present. At a later date, I will be going to Beijing, where talks will begin on Phase 2. Welcome now, Peter Coy. He's economics editor for Bloomberg Businessweek. So, Peter, it's a good day, good start to the new year, it looks like, for China right now.
Yeah, for sure. The signing of the trade deal is a big positive. That's been a big drag on the Chinese economy. We also had some good news from China on its economic indicators The manufacturing purchasing managers index came out positive territory, and the sub-index for export orders, for new orders for export, was positive for the first time since May 2018. And of course, this was the day that Xi Jinping gave his annual New Year, Civil New Year speech, in which he said that he believes that 2020 will be the year that China becomes a, quote, moderately prosperous society, and that its GDP may reach 100 trillion yuan. Nice even number.
And also making progress on something he's very concerned about, which is per capita GDP, because China's GDP obviously has been growing very rapidly,
right,
but they've been really focused on really moving it into the middle level.
And that could hit $10,000.
Well, those are real numbers you're talking about now. Are the two at all linked, do you think? That is, the trade agreement on the other hand and possible progress in GDP growth and per capita GDP growth?
Well, naturally, China's economy is more dependent on export than the U.S. economy is. Although I must say the current account balance in China has come down to roughly zero. That is, if you look worldwide, China is importing about as much as it exports. The balance with the U.S. is skewed very badly.
There are projections, I understand, actually, they will move to a trade deficit with the world, not with the U.S., but with the world.
Yeah. But that's the purpose of trade is not to generate a surplus, and that's sort of a Lighthiserian view of things. Actually, the purpose of trade is to enrich your people by exploiting what you can get better from the other countries than they can give to you. And so I think anything that can happen on this phase 1 trade deal, I don't have great hopes for the phase 2 trade deal, but it's nice that they're signing phase 1.
But you raise an interesting question about exactly what President Xi and the regime over there can do to really keep helping the Chinese economy move forward and the Chinese people move forward, which is terribly important to them.
Right.
On the one hand, they seem to be making progress in basically developing a consumer economy where they're buying more things. On the other hand, President Xi really wanted reforms of the state-owned enterprises. It feels like that's sort of almost gone by the wayside.
Well, the problem is, of course, is that he needs the state-owned enterprises because he wants to control the commanding heights of the economy, and he can do that through a state-owned enterprise much more easily than he can do it through a private enterprise. So rather than trying to replace the SOEs, he's trying to strengthen them, give them an even more important role in the Chinese economy.
But he's also said he wants some party representation in private companies on the boards. I mean, it's almost going the other way from privatizing SOEs.
Exactly. Where there would be Communist Party cells inside each company that would be in charge of sort of making sure they follow the rules, which in China means towing the party line.
Yeah. At the same time, they are liberalizing their capital markets to some extent. We're going to have insurance. We had J.P. Morgan announced today they're going to take over a majority shareholding interest in their futures dealing entity over in China.
Investment banking,
insurance comes in December.
And asset management, they're all moving in that direction with the understanding that China wants to become a world financial power, not just a world manufacturing power.
It's fascinating. Peter, thank you so much for joining us today. That is Bloomberg Businessweek's economics editor. He is Peter Coy. For what this phase 1 deal we've been talking about might mean for business, we welcome now Anna Ashton. She is Senior Director of Government Affairs at the China Business Council. She comes to us today from Washington. So welcome, Anna. Thank you for joining us. Answer the question I sort of posed, which is, what does this phase 1 deal potentially mean for U.S. businesses doing business in China?
Well, to some extent, we don't know yet. We haven't seen the details. We haven't seen the document, this 86-page document, but hopefully we will soon. And we have some clues from announcements that have been made by both sides. We know that a big component is, China's supposed purchase commitment to buy U.S. goods. It's a pretty big number. It will be interesting to see whether or not it's doable and whether or not it's sustainable. But beyond that, there are some other good things. There are commitments to improve IP protection. There are reiterations of existing commitments to prohibit tech transfer or in any sort of official capacity. And both of those things are progress on issues that companies care about. We'll have to wait and see how enforceable it is. But what we're hopeful will happen is that this will set a floor under the trade war. And we'll be able to see more regularized negotiations, the parties back at the table more frequently, and working on the issues that were really identified in the 301 report in greater depth, including things like subsidies to state-owned enterprises.
Anna, you raise a really interesting point, intriguing at least to me. Why is it that we don't really have much of a sense of what's in this agreement? Other than what the parties have said, it's sort of vague and even not necessarily consistent. It's an 86-page document. It doesn't take that long to translate. Is this typical? We won't see it until the moment they sit down to sign it?
Well, I think that there is a history of negotiations between the U.S. and China, including some differences in understanding. And for a very long time, preceding this administration, the effort to come to an agreed upon announcement that both sides could sign off on that detailed what was in the agreement was usually a difficult one. And so I'm not surprised that there may be behind the scenes challenges on that right now.
No, we've been told there'll be some dial back of tariffs, some dial back. That is, the ones that were going to go into effect in December don't go into effect, and also there'll be some cutting of the ones that went into effect last September. But there's a lot left under fairly substantial tariffs. What effect are those having, and what are the prospects of getting those lifted?
Yeah, I think this is a really important point. Businesses are thrilled that the two sides decided not to move forward with planned tariffs in December. That was very good news for businesses and for American consumers. It's also great news that the tariffs that were imposed in September have been cut by half, from 15% to about 7%. But the reality is that there are still tariffs, U.S. tariffs, on 2/3 of imports from China, and that includes 90% of things like components and inputs that are used in U.S. manufacturing here at home. So definitely the drag that tariffs have created for U.S. businesses is going to continue. It's just not going to get worse. Hopefully what we're going to see is that phase 2 negotiations actually will make a bit of progress, and tariff rollbacks will continue as a result.
And is it your sense and your members' sense that, in fact, the phase 1 might be, as they say, low-hanging fruit? That is, insofar as we've gotten some indication of what it is, okay, that was very good, that's nice. But if we're really going to go at fundamental things like subsidies to corporations and some of the really knotty questions about technology, is it going to be really difficult to pull it off, the rest of those tariffs?
Especially with things like the knotty problems with technology, one of the challenges is, how much of that can be discussed in the context of these trade negotiations. Both sides have declared that a lot of those issues involve national security, and so they're not appropriate for discussion within the trade negotiation context. They won't take them up. And yet, because we no longer have the strategic and economic dialogue, we don't have another venue for the two sides to discuss some of their differences on those issues. So hopefully what we're going to see is an expansion of these talks to include some opportunities for them to discuss some problems that they don't necessarily consider to be simple economic problems.
As you say, we hope that this phase 2 will move forward and will make some progress. At the same time, where are the incentives here? We just had the PMI numbers out of China today, which were, if anything, encouraging. It looks like the Chinese economy at least is stabilizing. It's not continuing to deteriorate. And President Trump keeps saying he likes having the tariffs because it means more money in his pocket the way he thinks of it.
Yeah, I mean, he does say that, and China's economic numbers today are better than they could be, and they certainly are one indication that China's not hurting as much from the trade war as the administration has said that it is. But I think that both sides have tremendous incentive from their public to try to bring this to an end, because both publics are actually feeling the effects of the trade war, and maybe not across the board in an even way, but certainly pockets of people here in the United States and in China are feeling it in a significant way.
Okay, Anna, thank you so much for joining us today. Really appreciate it. That's Anna Ashton of the U.S.-China Business Council in Washington. Still ahead is the gig up. Uber and Postmates are suing California over a labor rights law. That's coming up next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and radio. I'm David Weston. It is time now for our Stock of the Hour. Uber was down earlier, but it's erased those earlier losses. The company is suing the state of California to block a new labor law. Kaylee Alliance is here with more. And I must say, if this labor law really went into effect, they might have bigger losses. I'm not sure.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this, to be fair, is a stock that's already lost some 33% since it IPO'd earlier this year. Now, it, with Postmates, is suing California over this law as it relates to gig economy workers. Essentially, what the law says is that any contract workers that are part of the company's usual business have to be classified as employees. It's designed to make sure they get benefits like overtime, et cetera. And that has large implications for a company like Uber. When you look at its workforce, it has about 22,000 employees, nearly 4 million drivers that operate as independent contractors. So if Uber were to have to reclassify some of those employees in California, or drivers in California, as employees, having to pay out those benefits, that could have serious financial implications, especially considering this is a company that has yet to turn a profit. It's looking at a net adjusted loss of $6 billion this year. It's pledged profitability by 2021. The market has some doubts about that as it is, and a law like this could even further hinder those efforts.
California was the first one out of the blocks, but it's not the only one. New York is going after them as well, and they've got regulatory problems in London and a lot of places around the world. So they've got a lot of regulation they got to deal with.
They have a lot of regulation to deal with. Of course, with London, it's safety concerns. There's concerns about the gig economy workers, and all of that calls into question the company's profitability prospects. This is what we're seeing reflected in the stock. Now, I should note that with this regulation in particular, it's not just Uber and tech companies like it that are affected. There's other industries that are raising issue with this, like freelance journalists who say this could limit freedom of speech because it would limit the number of publications they can do with an individual outlet. You have trucking industry raising concerns. So it's not just Uber, although the implications for Uber may be a bit heightened
at the same
relative
time,
to
the
others.
gig economy may have certain ramifications. If we're really going to a gig economy, it has certain meanings. But on the question of Uber specifically, one of the issues I think with profitability has been pricing power.
Right.
And the problem of competition, places like Lyft and things like that, keeping the prices down. Unless they can get the prices up, they can't get out of the negative numbers.
Yeah, this ride-sharing space is a space which is growing more and more competitive, and food delivery as well. Uber Eats is a very important part of their business, and just overnight, the New York Post was out with a piece talking about Google being an entrant to this space and the implications it could have for likes of Uber Eats and Grubhub. I know Google, with its very deep pockets, we've seen the effect it's already had on the travel space, the likes of Expedia with Google Flights and hotels, et cetera. It could have the same impact on food delivery. And actually, Dan Ives, an analyst over at Wedbush, was quoted in that piece. He said that Google hasn't had an impact on Uber Eats as it stands right now, but that could change pretty dramatically in 2020. He actually said Uber might need to exit that business because of the loss that it's making, the fact that it's facing more competition. And that would be a hit to Uber, considering it makes up about 18% of its revenue.
It's okay, I've lost track, actually. What is their growth pattern? Because historically, their valuation has really been supported by how fast they're growing. Have they continued to grow as fast?
Well, subscriber growth is starting to slow down. You're not seeing as many users added, which frankly is what we're seeing with a lot of these technology companies. The growth is just not the pace it once was. So there's a question about that sustainability, especially in the face of this rising competition. Okay, Kaylee, thank you so much. Really great to have you with us. Kaylee Lines reporting on Uber. Up next here, the 2020 election is shaping up to be a fight over who gets to vote and who does not. Michael Waldman of the Brennan Center for Justice will be here for an overview of voter registration and suppression. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. From New York, this is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and radio. I'm David Weston. For Bloomberg First Word News, we go now to Viviana Hurtado.
David, we begin your first word with this New Year's Eve address. President Xi Jinping defending China's system for running Hong Kong. It was an unusually high-profile acknowledgement of the city's political turmoil. Mr. Xi argues the success of neighboring Macau shows the one country, two systems framework can succeed. On Wednesday, in Indian-controlled Kashmir, text messaging services will be restored. The move coming after a 5-month-long communications lockdown. Indian authorities saying they're concerned separatists will use the restored services to organize protests. Also to be restored broadband internet services in government-run hospitals. And over to France, that's where the government hopes strikes against its pension reform plans may be starting to wind down. Today, on the 27th straight day of labor action, subway and rail services around Paris improving slightly. Also today, French President Emmanuel Macron's traditional New Year's speech. And over in South Korea, the country's leadership is questioning a case involving the country's former Justice Minister Cho Kuk, facing 12 counts, including bribery and obstruction of justice. A spokesperson for South Korean President Moon Jae-in saying ahead of parliamentary elections, the scandal is damaging the ruling party. Global news 24 hours a day on air and on Quick Take by Bloomberg, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in more than 120 countries. I'm Viviana Hurtado. This is Bloomberg. David.
Thanks so much, Viviana. We head into 2020 with a new decision out of Georgia upholding the Secretary of State's decision to exclude some 100,000 voters from registration rolls for failing to vote in past elections, something that was hotly contested in the recent Senate race there, where Democratic candidate Stacey Abrams denounced her opponent, who was then the Secretary of State, for his aggressive moves on voter registration. Welcome now, Michael Waldman, president of the Brennan Institute for Justice at NYU. Mr. Waldman served in senior positions in President Clinton's administration and is the author of The Fight to Vote. And I must say, Michael, welcome, but also you're an authority in this subject. If we're going to talk to somebody about this, you're the person to talk to.
There's a lot to talk about because, you know, this is going to be obviously a very important election. Turnout could be at levels we haven't seen in decades, and there's a huge push for people to be able to vote and a push also to make it harder.
Well, if they turn out to vote, they have to be able to vote, and they have to let them vote. They have to be registered. Talk specifically about the Georgia decision, because that's a hook at the moment on this.
Sure.
The Secretary of State, as I understand it, said you didn't vote in a certain number of past elections. We're going to take you off the rolls. That doesn't in itself sound so outrageous.
Well, it's got to follow the law, and people have to get notice and not have their right to vote taken away just because they didn't like a candidate sometime. You know, somebody who voted for Obama in 2012 and then didn't want to vote for Hillary Clinton shouldn't be knocked off the voter rolls.
So how did they find out? Do they have to show up at the polling booth and say, I'm sorry, you're not on the list?
That's the problem, is we have a mess of a voter registration system in a lot of ways, and it gets a lot worse when people are wrongly purged from the voter rolls. The Brennan Center for Justice, where I work, did a study. 17 million people were knocked off the voter rolls in a 2-year period.
17 million?
In the most recent time. That's not all bad, but here's the really worrisome fact. The rate of purges was much higher in the states that used to be covered by the Voting Rights Act of 1965. In other words, states like Georgia with a history of racial discrimination in voting. Over 1 million people who were purged at a rate higher than others in the country. So there's lots of reason to worry. In Georgia, you did in the past have the Secretary of State, Kemp, running for governor while running the elections. And even this time, in this thing that the judge said, you have to bring a state lawsuit. It may still be challenged by Stacey Abrams and others. 22,000 people, the state itself said, oops, we didn't mean to knock them off the rolls. So this is the kind of thing that's happening all over the country. In Wisconsin, a conservative group was suing and pressuring the state to purge hundreds of thousands of voters. And the partisan and political nature of some of this, one of the top advisors to the Trump campaign was talking off the record, and it was leaked to the Associated Press in Wisconsin. He said, we traditionally use voter suppression. This time we're going to try to actually encourage our people to vote. So, you know, that's the thing you're not supposed to say out loud, but it shows how intense a fight this is going to be.
So when we think of things like voter registration, voter suppression, a lot of us go back into the 50s, the 40s. We think about Jim Crow laws and things like that, you know, various tests that were given to people to exclude them from the voting rolls. Stacey Abrams, that you referred to, I referred to as well, actually said this about that, saying basically we've moved from a day when we just used intimidation to other more subtle means. This is what she said.
We have always struggled with voter suppression. But what's happened in the last 20 years is that it's gone underground. It's no longer hoses and laws that say you cannot vote. It is this insidious nature that says it's race neutral, that we're just putting in these laws in place for everyone. But we know that it has a disproportionate effect on the communities that have long been marginalized.
How do you deal with something that is race neutral?
Well,
on its face.
She's exactly right. That's a sophisticated and accurate way of looking at it. And it's unfortunately been that way through a lot of the country's history. Recently, a federal court struck down a number of new voting laws in North Carolina that were, again, on their face, neutral in terms of race. But the federal court found that it had excluded black voters with, quote, almost surgical precision. The politicians and the political consultants and advisors who write these laws know very well who uses what day of early voting or what kind of voter ID some people have and others don't have. So we need strong court action to back up the right to vote that's in the Constitution repeatedly. We also need politicians to stop making there's very sacred core American values, something that's a political tactic, and voters really need to be serious about making sure that they're on the rolls and are going to get to have their chance to speak.
We're speaking with Michael Waldman. He's the president of the Brennan Center for Justice down at NYU. You mentioned Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act. Let's talk about that and bring us up to speed on that, because there was a time that certain states and certain districts had to go to the Justice Department for approval if they were going to change their voting rules in any way, shape, or form. That now has been struck down, as I understand it, by the Supreme Court. What has been the aftermath? The Voting Rights Act still is in effect, but you don't have to go to the Justice Department. You can bring an action, as I understand it, under the Voting Rights Act. Is anybody doing that?
Well, the thing you can do now under the Voting Rights Act is, after something is all said and done, after somebody who maybe got elected after racial discrimination in voting is in office, you can sue after the fact. It is not remotely as effective. And the Voting Rights Act, and it's poignant, of course, to even talk about it, as we've just learned of the illness of John Lewis, who was the hero, one of the heroes in Selma, Alabama, who was beaten by police and whose struggle and sacrifice helped educate the country as to why you needed a Voting Rights Act in 1965. It has been the most effective civil rights law in the country's history. It said that states that had a history of racial discrimination in voting, if they wanted to change their practices or laws or do things like purge people from the rolls, they had to get approval in advance from the Justice Department or a federal court. And that fact really made it different. It really changed the country in a very positive way. And what happened was, in 2013, Chief Justice Roberts wrote an opinion. He said, in Shelby County, it was called, he said, basically, that was then, this is now. We don't have these problems anymore. Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg wrote a dissent. She said, that's like standing in a rainstorm, holding an umbrella and not getting wet, and therefore concluding you don't need an umbrella, you're not wet. What happened after that decision was there was a wave in the southern states, especially, of new laws, new practices, such as the surge in purging in those states and other things that make it harder for some people to vote. And so it's unfortunately, even though it's neutral and high tech, it's a bit of a throwback, and it was green lighted by the United States Supreme Court.
So let's turn to the other side of this for a minute, and that is a move in some states to allow former felons to vote, which traditionally had been banned. We actually have the new Kentucky governor, Mr. Beshear, speaking out on this. This is what he said.
I believe in the law. As Attorney General, I was proud to work with law enforcement to prosecute those that have broken the law and to make sure that we sought justice. I also believe in redemption, in second chances.
So what's the status of that? How many states are moving forward with that? Is that prevalent?
Well, it's a great question, because while you have these intense and often partisan fights over here on voting, over here you have real heartening progress on something that is a legacy of the Jim Crow era, which is these laws that in different states, there are different ways. We don't have one election system in this country. We have 50 states and actually thousands of counties doing this that have said in a lot of places, if you have a past criminal conviction, you can't vote, or you have to go through a lot to get your right to vote restored. A few years ago, there were 3 states that had a lifetime ban on voting if you had any felony conviction for anything at any age. Florida had 1.4 million people unable to vote.
Florida.
Alone. And there, in 2018, the voters passed a ballot measure by 64%, ending that system of lifetime disenfranchisement and giving that right to vote back to those people. And there have been obstacles thrown up by the legislature, but it was a huge breakthrough. And this was not a left or a right issue. There were religious groups, law enforcement, conservatives, and progressives all working for it. Now you heard Kentucky also had that lifetime ban, and the new governor on his first week in office took this action. The only state that has a lifetime ban left, interestingly, is Iowa. Not necessarily where you would expect it. There's certainly a lot of candidates and journalists trooping through Iowa, and maybe they can be persuaded to change it as well. It's a real positive racial justice breakthrough, and it is not a left or a right issue. It's something people come together on.
It's fascinating. Michael, thank you so much for being here. I hope you'll come back and keep us up to date on how we're doing with voter registration and suppression through this election. That'd be great. That's Michael Waldman. He's president of the Brennan Center for Justice at NYU Law School. Coming up, the USMCA is on track for congressional ratification if and when the Senate gets done with impeachment. We talk with former U.S. Ambassador to Mexico, Antonio Garza. That's coming up next. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and radio. I'm David Weston. After 3 long years, it looks like the USMCA, that successor to NAFTA, will finally get congressional approval in the new year. To talk about what this could mean for Mexico, we welcome now Antonio Garza. He's former U.S. Ambassador to Mexico under President George W. Bush. Mr. Garza is now counsel to White and Case, and he comes to us today from Mexico City for our conversation in chief. So, Mr. Ambassador, thank you so much for being with us. We always enjoy having you with us. It looks like we'll finally get this USMCA done. Is there a sense of relief in Mexico? Is there a sense of almost resentment? Why did it take us so long?
Well, I think your first characterization is probably more accurate. Rather than celebrate it, there was more of a sense of relief after a couple of years of negotiation, a lot of anxiety, the occasional threat on tariffs as related to immigration and border security, and then that little hiccup at the end with respect to the labor provisions. But I would say generally, it's been well received. It's an agreement that there are a lot of winners and losers, and perhaps not an additional or a next generation step in the direction of free trade, but it preserves a North American platform for production. And I think Canadians, Mexicans, and people all across the U.S. Should be pleased that it seems to be headed towards ratification the early part of 2020.
Yeah, Mr. Ambassador, you make a really important distinction. I was going to ask, with ratification, assuming it happens in the USMCA, does that make the economic life better in Mexico, or does it just not make it worse?
Well, I think it actually, that's a good question. I think it's better in the sense that you have an agreement. It'll bring a certain level of certainty to investors. As one friend of mine in Texas said, he says, listen, Tony, let's not criticize a dog for not dancing well. Let's applaud it for dancing at all. And so the fact that we've got an agreement, I think, is a step forward in terms of preserving an environment that has functioned very well for investors. And created, thousands, hundreds of thousands of jobs in 3 countries, that we preserve that platform. So I say a net positive, to be sure.
We're talking with Antonio Garza. He's former U.S. Ambassador to Mexico. Put this in the context, if you would, Mr. Ambassador, of the larger Mexican economy and how specifically President Lopez Obrador is doing right now down there. As I understand, there's a little bit of an uneasy relationship with the private sector. Is that fair?
Well, I think that's a fair assessment, David, and a very nuanced sense of what's going on. If you look at the first year or so of President Lopez Obrador's presidency, you'd have to give him generally good marks on macro stability. The peso has stood firm. Generally, I think his stewardship of the macro economy of the country has been well received. Bringing USMCA or TMEC to completion for an individual that was never characterized as a free trader or a committed free trader, to stay hitched to that was well received. And thirdly, the way they've managed the bilateral relationship. But I think it's important to note that from the perspective of the economy generally, there's simply been no growth. And while USMCA, I think, is a welcome relief to larger investors, multinationals, and larger Mexican business community, what I'm starting to hear is concern amongst the smaller and mid-sized businesses about the consolidation of power that has been attendant to this administration's tenure, and the undermining of institutions with respect to human rights or the Electoral Commission, and even the courts. So if you look at foreign direct investment for 2018, curiously, it was actually up for foreign direct investment, but Mexican investment was way down. And I think perhaps they're seeing things or concerned about things like that lack of growth, security, violence, and this administration's when they've involved themselves in the economy, for example, the suspension of the airport contract at the start of the administration, that was a blow. And then later hitting pause on energy reform. I think within the country, there's still some concerns as to how committed to investment and economic growth this administration is.
So, Ambassador Garza, you raised two very specific areas that I wanted to ask about. Let's start with infrastructure. I'll use the airport as a way to get into that. How important is investment in infrastructure to really get that growth going in Mexico?
Well, typically at the start of any new administration, there is some slowdown in terms of infrastructure investment and governmental investment. Here, in addition to that traditional slowdown at the start of any new administration, there was a suspension of that airport, an $18 billion infrastructure project. And then with the desire to maintain austerity in the public finances, there was simply not a sufficient level of resources allocated to public spending. So you've seen that act as a headwind as well. So infrastructure has gone not only slow in the traditional sense of the first year of an administration, but more slowly because the resources simply aren't there. And there has, David, been some concern about the type infrastructure that this administration has been committed to. A 3-airport solution, 2 refineries that generally have not gotten rave reviews as to the economics. And so there is concern that not only was it slow, but perhaps not as smartly targeted as it might have been.
The other thing you mentioned, Ambassador Garza, former U.S. ambassador to Mexico, the other thing you mentioned, Mr. Ambassador, was energy and energy reform. Give us a sense of where that stands at this point. There have been attempts in the past administrations drive energy reform. What's the role of Pemex in all this, and is energy reform moving forward at all?
Well, you know, it really hasn't. At the start of the administration, President Lopez Obrador recommitted to the Pemex model and hit pause on any next generation of private investment in the energy space. And as you've seen, this administration has made massive investments in Pemex. And at the same time, there has not been significant increases in production. In fact, in the third quarter of this year, Pemex sustained $4.4 billion worth of losses. So you have the Pemex issue hitting pause on further investment in the energy space from private capital around the world that I think was very necessary to get the production numbers back up. And on the electricity side here recently, you've seen this administration recommit themselves to more state involvement in electricity, in everything from transmission costs associated with private generators to permitting issues, to these sorts of things I think are troublesome. And when you think about energy, that quite literally powers the economy. So I think there's that concern in the country as well.
So finally, Ambassador Garza, you mentioned austerity and the commitment to austerity. Typically, when a government, such as the Mexican government, commits itself to austerity, it's because it's concerned with inflation and wants to keep monetary policy relatively loose so that you can really have investment. What is the situation with inflation? Have they got it under control? And is there a prospect that the Mexican Central Bank could be cutting rates going into the new year?
Well, that's interesting because they have cut rates down to, I believe it's 7.5%, and there was some dissent within the central bank as to whether there should be more aggressive cuts. But I think that you've seen pretty much the limits. Certainly additional cuts might provide a bit more stimulus, but I think you've pretty much seen the limits to the impact of their monetary policy. And on the fiscal side, the resources simply aren't there to be spending more. So I think it's going to be an interesting year as he manages austerity to see how this administration reevaluates their commitment to energy reform and how they also address those underlying concerns of the domestic investor, of the Mexican business community as relates to security and violence that I think are very real concerns of the smaller and medium-sized businesses.
Okay, many thanks to Antonio Garza. He is former U.S. ambassador to Mexico. And coming up, a crisis in Australia. We count the cost of the raging wildfires there. That's coming up next. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and radio. I'm David Weston. Fireworks lit up the sky at Sydney Harbor as the land down under welcomed the new year earlier today. But in Australia, it's no time for celebration. Wildfires continue to rage across the country's east coast. New South Wales and Victoria have been particularly hit hard, with tourists escaping the fires, and they've had to flee to the beaches. The Australian military is being called in to help evacuate. California is also sending firefighters. 12 people have died so far. 5 more are missing. The tragedy has put focus on Australia's capacity to combat fires, especially since fire services are manned mostly by volunteers. Prime Minister Scott Morrison got criticized for taking a vacation in Hawaii during the crisis. He has since returned to Australia and addressed the work of his firefighters.
As this is a very prolonged fire season, this is putting additional demands on our firefighters in particular. And it means that the turnouts and the call-outs have been far more extensive than in previous years, going well and beyond and above what is normally expected of those who are engaged in volunteer service.
That was Australian Prime Minister Scott Morrison addressing the plight of firefighters in the land down under. Coming up on Balance of Power, we're going to continue on Bloomberg Radio. In our second hour, we're going to be back with Antonio Garza. He is former U.S. ambassador to Mexico under President George W. Bush. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio.